I paid my parents' mortgage for 9 years, but they left the whole house to my lazy brother. The realization didn't arrive with a scream or a dramatic confrontation. It sat there on the mahogany sideboard, tucked into a cream-colored folder, with the seal of a lawyer I had likely paid for, staring at me while the scent of pot roast and rosemary filled the air of the home I had spent my entire 20s and the first half of my 30s saving. I had just finished setting the table, using the linen napkins I'd bleached, the good silver I'd polished, and the crystal glasses I'd bought for my mother's 58th birthday, when my eyes caught the bold print on the top page. Last Will and Testament of Silas and Evelyn Vance. I shouldn't have looked, but in a house where I had been the architect of every financial bridge since I was 25 years old, curiosity wasn't a sin, it was a survival instinct. My breath hitched as I saw the distribution of assets, realizing that 100% of the real estate, including the 4-bedroom colonial we were currently standing in, was designated to Preston, my 31-year-old brother, a man who hadn't held a job for more than 3 consecutive months since he dropped out of college. He was the man who lived in the basement and found himself on my dime, while I worked grueling 80-hour weeks, climbing the corporate ladder to become a senior project manager, just to ensure my parents didn't end up losing everything they had built. I stood there, the weight of 9 years, 108 months of $5,200 transfers, pressing down on my chest like a physical hand, a crushing reminder that I had sacrificed my youth, my 20s, and my chance to buy my own dream home just to keep this roof over their heads. I heard my mother's laughter coming from the kitchen, that light, airy sound she only made when Preston was telling one of his tall tales, a sound that sliced through me, as she called out, "Cassandra, honey, stop hovering over the furniture and come help me with the gravy." Her voice was warm, the exact same voice that had called me 3 times a week for nearly a decade whenever the bank sent a final notice or the property taxes were in arrears. I closed the folder, my fingers lingering on the cool paper as I felt a strange, icy clarity wash over me. It wasn't anger yet, but something much more dangerous, the sound of a key turning in a lock that had been jammed for a long, long time. I walked into the kitchen, my heels clicking softly on the tile I had paid to have installed 2 summers ago, and I looked at my mother, Evelyn, standing there in her Sunday best, acting as if the world was exactly as it should be, while Preston was leaning against the counter, picking at a piece of roast beef with his fingers. He looked at me with that same smug, narrow-eyed grin he'd used since we were children, the look of a boy who knew he was the favorite, even when he was the failure, and said, "You look tense, sis. Maybe you should take a vacation. Oh, wait, you're too busy being the boss lady for that, right?" He laughed, and my mother joined in, patting his arm affectionately before saying, "Now, Preston, don't tease your sister. She provides so much for this family." And in that moment, the word provides felt like a violent slur. Before I tell you what I did next, I want to ask you, have you ever been the one person holding everything together, only to realize the people you're saving are secretly plotting to leave you with nothing? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever dealt with a family that treats your hard work like a common utility they're entitled to, because it always helps to know I'm not the only one who has lived through this kind of betrayal. I didn't say a word about the folder as we sat down to eat, simply watching my 60-year-old father, Silas, pray over the food, thanking God for the blessings of this house, and I wondered if he realized that those blessings came in the form of a recurring ACH transfer from my Chase private client account every first of the month. I waited until the meal was halfway over, the silence of my own observations becoming a heavy shroud before I finally spoke, my voice calm and perfectly modulated. "So, I saw the papers on the sideboard." The room went deathly quiet. My father's fork clattered against his plate. My mother's smile didn't fade, but instead froze into a porcelain mask, and Preston didn't even stop chewing, simply leaning back with his chest puffing out slightly. "We were going to tell you, Cassandra," my mother said, her voice dropping that performative sweetness for something sharper and more defensive. "We just didn't think it was the right time." I looked at her directly and asked, "The right time to tell me that the over $560,000 I've spent keeping this roof over your heads since I was 25 years old is essentially a gift to a man who doesn't even pay for his own cell phone bill?" I didn't raise my voice because I didn't have to. The truth was loud enough. My father cleared his throat, refusing to look me in the eye as he muttered, "It's about the family legacy, Cassandra. Preston is a man. He has the Vance name to carry on. And you're 34, you're highly successful, you have your own luxury condo downtown. You don't need this house, but Preston needs a foundation." I stared at the man who had raised me, feeling a cold detachment settle into my bones. "He's 31 years old, Dad," I replied. "If he hasn't built a foundation by now, giving him one for free isn't helping him. It's just rewarding his parasitic lifestyle." My mother slammed her hand on the table, her eyes flashing with a sudden vicious anger. "How dare you? You are a selfish girl, Cassandra, always have been. You've always been jealous of your brother because we had to give him a little more grace. You've been blessed with a high-paying job and a cold heart, and you're sitting here in your designer suit, begrudging your own flesh and blood a place to call home?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the deep lines of entitlement etched around her mouth, realizing with absolute clarity that she viewed me not as a daughter, but as a silent, high-yield investment. "I'm selfish?" I whispered, my voice thick with the grief of a stolen decade. "I've paid the mortgage, the insurance, the utilities, the landscaping, and even your dental work for 9 years. I haven't taken a real vacation in 3 years because I was worried about the balloon payment that was due last spring. And you're calling me selfish because I expect my contribution to be recognized in the equity of this home." Preston snorted, a piece of roast beef falling from his mouth onto his plate. "It's just paper, Cassandra. Why you gotta make everything about money? You're rich. Just let it go. Besides, Mom's right. The house stays with the Vance men. That's how it's always been in this family." He actually winked at me, and that tiny, arrogant movement of his eyelid was the final grain of sand that broke the scale, erasing any lingering guilt I might have harbored about walking away. I didn't argue, I didn't cry, and I certainly didn't scream. I stood up, wiped my mouth with the linen napkin, folded it perfectly, and picked up my leather handbag. "You're right, Preston," I said, my voice as smooth as glass. "It is just money, and it is about legacy." I walked to the door, my parents calling after me, my mother's voice turning back into that shrill, demanding tone she used when a bill was late. But I didn't turn around. I walked out into the cool evening air, got into my Mercedes, the quiet purr of the engine a stark contrast to the stagnant, toxic atmosphere of that dining room, and I sat there for a moment in the driveway, looking at the house. It was a beautiful home with fresh paint, a manicured lawn, and a new roof, all courtesy of my labor, my lost weekends, my sleepless nights. I opened my banking app, the screen glowing in the dim light of the cabin, and it took exactly 3 taps to navigate to the automatic transfers section. Automatic transfers, mortgage, Silas/Evelyn. Status, active. I hit cancel, the app prompting me with a warning. "Are you sure you want to cancel this recurring payment?" And I hit yes without a single hesitation. Then I went to the insurance portal, clicked Remove Property, 114 Oakcrest Drive, and hit Done. Finally, I logged into the family cellular plan, selected the lines belonging to Silas, Evelyn, and Preston, and disconnected them all. By the time I backed out of the driveway, I had reclaimed over $6,000 a month in personal overhead, and as the heavy burden lifted from my shoulders, I felt lighter than I had since I was 24 years old. I knew they wouldn't notice for a few weeks because they were too busy celebrating Preston's inheritance, completely blind to the fact that an inheritance of a debt-filled property is only a gift if someone else is paying the debt. As I drove toward my high-rise downtown, the city lights reflecting off my windshield like a promise of a new life, I realized that for 9 years, I hadn't been a daughter. I had been a bank. And as of tonight, the bank was officially closed for business. I reached for my phone, blocked Preston's number first, and then, with a heavy heart but a perfectly steady hand, I placed my parents on Do Not Disturb, welcoming the absolute peace that followed. It was the beautiful, profound silence of a woman who had finally stopped carrying a world that wasn't hers to save. A woman who had just reclaimed her youth, her finances, and her crown. But even as the relief washed over me, I knew the storm was coming. In exactly 30 days, the bank would come knocking. And for the first time in his pampered 31 years of life, the golden heir to the Vance legacy was going to have to find a way to pay for the throne he'd so arrogantly stolen. The silence was the first thing I noticed, a heavy, velvet-lined quiet that didn't just exist in my luxury apartment, but seemed to emanate from my own skin now that I was no longer vibrating with the anxiety of 1,000 unpaid responsibilities. For the first week, I woke up at 5 a.m. as I always did, my heart racing with the phantom urge to check the family group chat for emergencies, a broken water heater, a property tax reassessment, or Preston's latest business opportunity that required a bridge loan. But as the days bled into a second week, that frantic energy began to settle into something cooler and more substantial. I went to work at the firm, leading my team through the final stages of a $20 million urban redevelopment project, and I realized that the same precision and ruthlessness I used to manage contractors and city officials was exactly what I had been lacking in my personal life, having spent my entire 20s being a world-class architect for everyone's dreams except my own. On the 15th of the month, the first ripple of the coming storm appeared in the form of a notification from my cellular provider informing me that the 3 lines I had disconnected were no longer eligible for reactivation under my corporate discount plan. I didn't respond to the automated text. I simply put my phone face down on my desk and returned to my blueprints. An hour later, the office line rang, and my assistant Maya, a sharp 26-year-old who knew the rhythm of my life better than anyone, buzzed my intercom with a hesitant voice saying, "Cassandra, your mother is online too. She sounds frantic and says her cell phone is dead and she had to use the neighbor's Wi-Fi to call." I didn't stop reviewing the contracts in front of me. I simply pressed the button and said, "Tell her I am in meetings all day, Maya, and please route any future calls from that number directly to my voicemail." I spent that evening at a jazz club alone, sipping a glass of neat bourbon and listening to a saxophone player wail about a kind of heartbreak I was finally beginning to outrun, feeling the intoxicating, unfamiliar rush of spending my own hard-earned money on my own peace. The real test came on the first of the following month, the exact day that $5,200 anchor was scheduled to leave my account, a day I usually spent nervously checking my balance to ensure my parents' medical emergencies hadn't drained the buffer I tried to maintain. This morning, however, I simply sat on my balcony with a cup of Earl Grey, watching the sun rise over the Atlanta skyline, my banking app remaining firmly closed. By noon, the office phone was ringing incessantly, and Maya finally walked into my office, her expression tight with concern, holding a stack of message slips. "They're calling back-to-back, Cassandra. Your father left a message saying the bank called them about a bounced mortgage payment, and he needs you to fix the glitch immediately." Before I tell you how I responded to the 60-year-old man who expected his 34-year-old daughter to fund her own replacement, I want to ask you, have you ever been the fixer in your family, only to realize that as soon as you stop fixing, you become the villain in their story? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had your successes used as a justification for why you should bear everyone else's burdens, because reading your stories gives me the strength to keep telling mine. I waited until I was finished with my workday, until I had successfully closed the deal on the new waterfront plaza, before I finally returned the call from my private office line, knowing they would all be gathered in the kitchen waiting for their safety net to deploy. My 58-year-old mother answered on the first ring, her voice breathless and demanding. "Cassandra, thank God. Did you talk to the bank? Silas is having palpitations, and Preston had to cancel his networking event because he's so stressed about the house." "I didn't call the bank, Mama," I said, my voice steady, completely devoid of the tremor of guilt they usually relied on to get their way. "There's nothing to clear up, because I canceled the transfer." There was a silence so profound I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in their kitchen, a refrigerator I had bought 3 years ago when I was still convinced I could buy their respect. Then, my father's voice boomed in the background, clearly listening on the extension. "What do you mean you canceled it? That's the mortgage, Cassandra. That's our home." "No, Dad," I replied calmly, leaning back in my leather chair. "That's Preston's home. According to the will I saw on the sideboard, 100% of that property belongs to the Vance legacy. And since I'm apparently just a selfish girl with a cold heart who doesn't need a foundation, I decided it was time for the actual owner to take over the financial responsibilities." My mother's voice came back, shrill and panicked, completely stripping away her sweet church lady facade. "You can't do this. You know your 31-year-old brother doesn't have that kind of money right now. He's just getting started with his new vision. You're trying to ruin him out of pure spite." "I'm not trying to ruin anyone, Mama. I'm simply stepping out of the way so your son can be the man you've always claimed he is. You said he needed a foundation to carry on the name. Well, here it is. The foundation is built, the roof is sealed, and all he has to do is pay for the privilege of keeping it." Preston must have grabbed the receiver then, his voice thick with a desperation he tried to mask with aggressive bravado. "Listen, Cassie, don't be like this. We're family. I know you're mad about the will, but we can talk about that later. Right now, the bank is talking about late fees and foreclosure proceedings if the payment isn't made by Friday. Just cover this month and we'll figure out a plan, I swear." "You'll pay me back with what, Preston?" I asked, my tone dropping to a quiet whisper that commanded more respect than any scream ever could. "With the money you don't have from the jobs you refuse to keep? You've been living a life subsidized by my sacrificed 20s, while looking down on me for being too busy to be a real part of the family. Well, now I have all the time in the world, and so do you. So you have exactly 4 days to find $5,200, and I suggest you start updating your resume." I hung up the phone before he could respond, before the insults could start, before the emotional gaslighting could begin, and I felt a strange sensation in my chest, not the heavy ache of betrayal, but the sharp, clean sting of a surgical incision, finally cutting the rot out of my life. Over the next week, the escalation was cinematic, with my mother sending a barrage of emails shifting from fiery anger to pleading descriptions of medical emergencies that mysteriously appeared whenever a bill was due, claiming my father's blood pressure was skyrocketing because of the stress I was causing. But I didn't budge because I knew my father's health was fine from the premium physical I had paid for 3 months prior. I started receiving calls from distant aunts and cousins, people I hadn't heard from in years, all of them echoing the same manipulated script, asking how a 34-year-old woman with so much could be so small-minded toward her aging parents, making me realize that my family hadn't told the community they were disinheriting me, but rather that I was attacking them out of pure corporate greed. But as I gathered my things to leave the office on Friday, relishing the quiet victory of my boundaries, Maya hurried back in, her face pale as she handed me an overnight courier envelope that had just been dropped off at the front desk by a private process server. I tore it open, expecting an angry letter from my aunt or a desperate summons from their pastor, but instead my eyes landed on a legal document that made the blood freeze in my veins, revealing a secret so dark it proved my parents hadn't just disinherited me. They had been actively helping my brother destroy me. The document in my hands was heavy, printed on thick legal paper with the intimidating letterhead of a firm called Apex Strategic Holdings. And as my eyes scanned the dense legalese, the sterile office around me seemed to fade into a vacuum of absolute silence. It was a notice of default and intent to initiate civil litigation. But it wasn't just addressed to my parents. My name was listed as the primary guarantor on a $250,000 high-interest private equity loan that had been secured against the Oakcrest property 6 months ago. I stared at the signature line, my eyes tracing the loops and angles of a name that was supposed to be mine, but the handwriting was just slightly too sharp, the pressure too heavy. It was a forgery, and not a particularly good one, executed by a 31-year-old man who had spent his entire life studying my habits well enough to mimic my success, but lacking the discipline to actually achieve it. But the true horror wasn't Preston's signature. It was the two signatures directly below it on the notary and witness lines, bearing the unmistakable cursive script of my 58-year-old mother Evelyn and my 60-year-old father Silas. They hadn't just disinherited me, they had actively conspired to use my pristine credit and corporate standing as collateral to fund Preston's delusions, knowing full well that if he defaulted, which he inevitably would, I would be legally bound to pay off a $250,000 debt just to protect my own career and reputation. I didn't scream, I didn't throw the papers across the room, and I didn't break down into uncontrollable sobs. Instead, I felt a chilling, terrifying calm settle over my body, the kind of absolute emotional detachment that only arrives when the last microscopic thread of hope you had for your family is surgically severed. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the direct line to my personal attorney, David Ross, a man who had helped me navigate the cutthroat world of corporate real estate and who knew exactly how ruthless I could be when backed into a corner. When he answered, I didn't waste time on pleasantries, simply stating, "David, I need you in my office immediately. I've just been served with a fraudulent debt notice for $250,000, and the perpetrators are my parents and my brother." Within 30 minutes, David was sitting across from me, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he reviewed the documents, his professional demeanor cracking slightly as he muttered, "This is incredibly reckless, Cassandra. This private equity firm, Apex, they are essentially legal loan sharks who prey on desperate people with valuable assets. And because your parents co-signed as witnesses to your guarantee, they've committed felony fraud." I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the city skyline, realizing that my parents' frantic phone calls over the past week weren't just about saving their home from the primary bank's foreclosure. They were terrified because my cancellation of the primary mortgage payment had triggered a default clause in this secondary predatory loan, meaning Apex was now coming to collect the entire sum. They used the $5,200 I was sending them every month as proof of income to secure this loan, I whispered, the puzzle pieces finally snapping together into a grotesque picture of betrayal. They let me believe I was keeping a roof over their heads, when in reality, they were using my money to hold off the primary bank, while Preston bled the equity dry to fund whatever imaginary business venture he was playing at this time. For a woman conditioned to be the strong black woman, the mule of the world, the shock absorber for everyone else's mistakes, the path of least resistance would have been to pay it, swallow the loss to protect my family from prison, and quietly untangle myself. But the woman sitting in that chair was 34 years old, exhausted, and finally awake to the reality that my mercy was only enabling their monstrosity. "Draft the police report, David," I said, my voice completely steady, devoid of any hesitation. "But don't file it yet. First, I want you to contact Apex Strategic Holdings and tell them that the guarantor, Cassandra Vance, is prepared to negotiate a buyout of this debt, not as a victim, but as an independent investor." David raised an eyebrow, a slow smile spreading across his face as he realized what I was planning. "You want to buy the fraudulent note," he said. "You want to become their primary creditor." "If they want to treat me like a bank," I replied, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from my silk skirt, "then I am going to act like one. I want to own the debt, I want to hold the deed, and I want to be the one who decides exactly when the wrecking ball hits their foundation." The wire transfer cleared at exactly 10:14 a.m. on Tuesday, moving $250,000 from my high-yield investment accounts into the predatory coffers of Apex Strategic Holdings. And as the confirmation number flashed on my dual monitor setup, I didn't feel the familiar panic of financial loss. Instead, I felt the cold, heavy weight of absolute sovereignty, realizing I was now the sole owner of the debt that chained my family to the earth, and the legal master of the house they had tried to steal from me. Over the weekend, the silence from Oakcrest Drive had been deafening, a pressurized stillness that told me they were waiting for the axe to fall, completely unaware that I wasn't just dodging the blade, I was buying the guillotine. On Monday morning, before the transfer even went through, as I stepped out of my building to head to the bank to finalize the paperwork, I found 31-year-old Preston waiting by my car in the underground parking garage, looking terrible in wrinkled designer clothes, the smug arrogance he usually wore replaced by a frantic, jittery desperation that made him look every bit the failure he was. "Cassie, wait," he had called out, stepping into my path, holding his hands up in a placating gesture as my hand hovered over the panic button on my keys. "I know you're mad. I know the bank sent you some papers, but you have to let me explain. It was just a bridge loan, a temporary thing to get my new real estate consulting firm off the ground. Mom and Dad believed in the vision, and we were going to pay you back with interest before you ever even knew about it." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, just a cold, clinical observation of a parasite trying to reattach itself to a host. And I said, "You forged my signature, Preston. You committed felony fraud, and you manipulated our aging parents into risking their freedom to witness it." He scoffed, trying to inject a note of his old bravado into the interaction, telling me not to be so dramatic, that it was just a signature, that we were family, and that my excellent credit meant it didn't cost me anything to help him out, begging me to just pay it off to save our father's heart from the stress. I stepped closer to him, refusing to yield an inch of space, and whispered, "Dad's heart is perfectly fine, Preston, but yours is going to stop when you realize I'm not paying the loan to clear your name. I am buying the loan, which means you will owe me $250,000, and if you cannot produce those funds, I will not only foreclose on the house, but I will hand the forged documents over to the district attorney." The blood had drained from his face so quickly he looked translucent, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. And as I walked past him to get into my car, I told him to gather the family at the house on Tuesday evening, because I was bringing the deed. Before I tell you what happened when I walked into that living room, holding the chains they had forged for me, I have to ask, have you ever had to become the person your family feared, just to protect the person you were meant to be? Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from, and if you've ever had to use the power you built to dismantle the world that tried to break you, because I am reading every single comment tonight. I drove to Oakcrest Drive that Tuesday evening, pulling my Mercedes in behind a familiar beige sedan in the driveway that told me my 58-year-old mother had called in reinforcements. My 62-year-old Aunt Martha, the self-appointed matriarch of the extended family, whose entire personality was built on weaponizing scriptures to keep women in their place. Walking through the front door with my key for what I knew would be one of the last times, the scent of old carpet and simmering greens hit me, a nostalgic smell that now felt like a meticulously crafted trap designed to soften my resolve. But I simply adjusted the lapels of my tailored blazer and walked into the living room where the court of public opinion was waiting. My 60-year-old father, Silas, sat in his worn recliner looking deflated. Evelyn and Aunt Martha shared the floral sofa like two judges on a tribunal, and Preston paced near the fireplace, his eyes darting toward the front door as if he were calculating the distance to his escape. "Cassandra, sit down," Aunt Martha commanded, her voice thick with the unearned authority of age. "Your mother has been weeping for 2 days because you've let your corporate success turn your heart to stone. We are here to pray the pride out of your spirit before you destroy this family over a simple financial misunderstanding." I didn't sit, preferring to stand near the entryway, the physical distance mirroring the emotional chasm I had finally accepted, and I looked directly at Aunt Martha, telling her there was no misunderstanding, and that if my mother was weeping, it was because she got caught helping her son commit a felony. My mother gasped, a highly performative sound, as she clutched her chest, crying out that Preston just made a mistake with some paperwork to build a legacy for the Vance name, and that I was treating him like a criminal. I slowly unclasped my leather briefcase, pulled out the thick manila folder containing the Apex Strategic Holdings note, and dropped it onto the glass coffee table with a heavy, final thud, announcing, "He didn't make a mistake, Mama. He forged my signature on a $250,000 loan, and you and Dad signed your names right beneath his as witnesses, essentially handing me a 20-year prison sentence if I had decided to let the state prosecute you for fraud. The room went dead silent, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway as Aunt Martha leaned forward, squinting at the documents, her self-righteous posture dissolving into sheer, unadulterated horror as she read the signatures for herself, whispering, "Silas, Evelyn, is this true?" and looking at my parents, who had both suddenly found the intricate patterns on the area rug fascinating. "It doesn't matter what they say, Martha," I interjected smoothly, taking a step toward my pacing brother, who had now frozen like a deer in the headlights, because as of this morning, I bought this debt from the private equity firm. I didn't do it to save the Vance legacy. I did it because I refused to have my name attached to a predatory lien, which means, Preston, you no longer owe Apex $250,000. You owe me. Preston's jaw worked silently for a moment before he spat out that I couldn't foreclose on my own parents, that the community would crucify me, and that I would lose everything I'd built downtown when people found out I put my elderly parents on the street. I smiled, a small, cold curve of my lips that did not reach my eyes, and replied, "The community doesn't pay my bills, Preston, and as for putting Mom and Dad on the street, I have already signed a 6-month lease for a secure 2-bedroom apartment across town in my name. They will move there by the end of the month. Their basic utilities will be paid by me, but they will never see another cash transfer. And you are expressly forbidden from ever setting foot on that property." My father finally looked up, his eyes wet with a shame so deep it looked physically painful. His voice trembling as he asked what would happen to the house he built for this family, and I delivered the final blow, telling him the house was being listed for sale on Friday. The equity would cover the primary mortgage he defaulted on when I stopped paying, and the rest would go toward satisfying the fraudulent loan his son took out, meaning there would be absolutely nothing left for the golden heir who had tried to steal my future. Preston lunged forward the moment the words left my mouth, his 31-year-old face contorting into an ugly, flushed mask of unadulterated rage, his hands curling into fists as he screamed that I was a bitter, lonely bitch stealing his inheritance. But he didn't even make it 2 steps before my 62-year-old Aunt Martha stood up, her heavy orthopedic shoes planting firmly on the hardwood floor, as she raised a hand that had directed church choirs and disciplined generations of children. "Sit down, Preston," Martha barked, her voice stripping away the sweet, prayerful cadence she had used only moments before, replacing it with the sharp, unforgiving tone of a matriarch who had just realized she was backing the wrong horse. She turned her piercing gaze from my trembling brother to my 58-year-old mother, Evelyn, and my 60-year-old father, Silas, her eyes scanning them as if they were strangers who had broken into her home. "Felony fraud, Evelyn? You and Silas co-signed a forged document on a $250,000 loan, jeopardizing your 34-year-old daughter's freedom and career, a daughter who gave you the very clothes on your backs and the food in your pantry, while this overgrown boy played businessman?" My mother began to sob in earnest, not the performative, delicate tears she used to manipulate me, but the heavy, gasping weeping of a woman whose deepest, most shameful secret had just been dragged into the light of the living room, and she reached out a shaking hand toward her sister, crying that they were just trying to protect the family name, that they didn't know how bad the private equity people were. But Martha simply stepped back, swatting the air as if Evelyn's excuses were infectious flies. "There is no family name left to protect, Evelyn. You've traded your dignity for a son who wouldn't cross the street to pour water on you if you were on fire. And you tried to sacrifice the only child who actually stood by you. Cassandra is right. You have made your bed, and now you will lie in it. And don't you dare call my house asking for a loan when this girl's money dries up." I watched this exchange with the clinical detachment of an archaeologist observing a ruined civilization, feeling no triumph, no joy, just the hollow, echoing certainty that I had spent my entire 20s bleeding for people who viewed me entirely as livestock. I picked up the manila folder from the glass coffee table, slipping it back into my leather briefcase with a quiet click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room, and I looked at my parents one last time. The movers I hired will be here on Thursday at 8 a.m. sharp. They will pack your clothes and your personal keepsakes to take to the new apartment. However, all the furniture I purchased, which is to say everything in this house, will be liquidated by an estate sale company on Friday to recoup the legal fees I incurred cleaning up your son's mess. Preston scoffed, crossing his arms and leaning against the mantelpiece as he tried to project an air of nonchalance, sneering, "You think you're so smart, Cassie, but you can't kick me out without a formal eviction notice. I have squatter's rights. I know the law." I didn't even blink as I reached into my blazer pocket, pulling out the folded official notice to quit that my attorney, David Ross, had prepared, and I tossed it onto the armchair nearest to him. "You don't have squatter's rights when the new lien holder has proof of criminal fraud attached to your residency, Preston. You have a grace period of exactly 48 hours before I send the sheriff to physically remove you. And if you damage so much as a single baseboard in this house before you leave, I will bypass the civil courts and go straight to the district attorney with the forgery evidence." The utter defeat in his eyes was absolute, the final collapse of a boy who had spent 3 decades coasting on the unearned privilege of his gender and his mother's blinding favoritism. And as I turned on my heel and walked out the front door into the cool, humid Atlanta night, I felt the heavy, suffocating armor I had worn for 9 years begin to crack and fall away. Before I tell you about the chilling discovery I made during the move-out process that proved my family's betrayal ran deeper than just money, I want to ask you, have you ever realized that the people you were sacrificing your life for were actually waiting for you to completely destroy yourself for their comfort? Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from, and if you've ever had to systematically dismantle a toxic family dynamic just to survive. Your engagement tells the algorithm to push these stories to other women who desperately need to hear that they are allowed to walk away. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in the psychological warfare of the desperate, with my phone silently filtering dozens of blocked voicemails and text messages from Preston, begging, threatening, and gaslighting, alternating between calling me a corporate savior and a bloodless monster. But I simply sat in my high-rise office downtown, sipping espresso and finalizing the architectural blueprints for a massive commercial plaza, completely undisturbed by the frantic flailing of the parasite I had finally detached. Thursday morning arrived with a sky the color of bruised slate, a heavy, threatening overcast that perfectly matched the atmosphere on Oakcrest Drive when I pulled up in my Mercedes, parking behind the massive moving truck I had prepaid to handle the relocation. I stepped out wearing tailored black slacks, a crisp white blouse, and a pair of sensible leather loafers, looking exactly like the project manager I was, ready to oversee the demolition of a condemned site. My father was sitting on the front porch steps, holding a single cardboard box filled with framed family photographs, his shoulders hunched, looking older and frailer than his 60 years, a broken man who had finally realized that his passive complicity was just as destructive as my mother's active manipulation. I didn't offer him comfort as I walked past. I merely unlocked the front door and let the moving crew inside, directing them with sharp, professional commands to begin clearing out the master bedroom and the kitchen. My mother was standing in the center of the dining room, clutching her favorite floral apron, staring blankly at the mahogany sideboard where this entire nightmare had begun. And when she saw me, she didn't yell or pray. She just whispered, "Where is your brother going to go, Cassandra? He packed his car last night and drove away without even telling us where he was heading." "He is 31 years old, Mama," I replied, my voice devoid of any inflection. "He is going to go wherever the world takes a man who has no money, no work ethic, and no sister to foot the bill. He is finally going to meet reality." I left her standing there and walked into the kitchen to supervise the packing of the fragile items, my eyes scanning the granite countertops and custom cabinetry I had paid to install, feeling a strange sense of closure as the space was systematically stripped of its warmth. I opened the bottom drawer of the built-in pantry, a space my mother notoriously used as a makeshift filing cabinet for her recipe clippings and old utility bills, to ensure the movers didn't accidentally pack any sensitive documents, and my hand brushed against a heavy, faux leather binder tucked all the way in the back, hidden beneath a stack of expired coupons. I pulled it out, noting the thick layer of dust on the cover, and opened it on the kitchen island, expecting to find old tax returns or warranties for appliances. But as my eyes adjusted to the bold print on the thick, watermarked paper, the breath was completely knocked out of my lungs, leaving me staggering against the counter. It was a life insurance policy, issued by a premier agency, and the insured party listed at the top was Cassandra Elaine Vance, with a benefit amount of $1.5 million. My hands began to shake, a fine, uncontrollable tremor, as I flipped through the pages, seeing the signatures at the bottom. My mother, Evelyn, acting as the policyholder who had taken it out on me when I was 27, claiming she was covering burial expenses and family loss for her high-earning daughter. But it was the beneficiary designation that made the blood freeze solid in my veins. The primary beneficiary was not my father, nor was it a trust to pay off the mortgage I was already covering. It was Preston Vance, entitled to 100% of the payout in the event of my untimely death. And pinned to the back of the policy was a ledger of premium payments, showing that for the last 7 years, they had been using a portion of the $5,200 I sent them every month to pay the massive premiums on a policy that would make my brother a millionaire if I worked myself into an early grave. They hadn't just been using me to live comfortably. They had actively placed a bet on my death, banking on the statistical likelihood that a black woman in her 30s, working 80-hour weeks in a high-stress corporate environment while carrying the financial weight of 3 adults, would eventually suffer a stress-induced heart attack, a stroke, or a breakdown. And when that day came, Preston wouldn't just inherit a house. He would inherit a fortune built on my corpse. The coldness that had settled over me during the last few weeks crystallized into an impenetrable diamond, a profound, chilling clarity that entirely erased any lingering shadow of daughterly guilt or societal obligation I might have subconsciously held on to. I didn't scream, I didn't tear the papers up, and I didn't march into the dining room to confront my mother. I simply closed the binder, slid it perfectly into my leather tote bag, and walked back out to the foyer where the movers were hauling the last of my parents' clothing boxes out to the truck. My father looked up at me from the porch, his eyes pleading for some sign of the daughter who used to buy him expensive cigars for Father's Day and listen to his stories about the old neighborhood. But when he looked into my face, he visibly flinched, recognizing that the woman standing before him was entirely hollowed out, replaced by a ruthless executive who had just discovered the ultimate corporate espionage. "The truck is loaded, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the humid air like a scalpel. "The driver has the address to the apartment, and the keys are with the property manager on site. Your lease is paid for exactly 6 months, during which time I suggest you and Mama figure out how to live on your Social Security, because when that lease expires, I will not be renewing it, and I will not be providing an alternative." My mother rushed out of the front door, her face streaked with tears, reaching for my arm. "Cassandra, please, you can't just cut us off completely. We're old. We don't know how to survive without your help." I looked down at her hand on my sleeve, and then I looked directly into her eyes, leaning in close so only she could hear my next words. "I found the life insurance policy, Mama. I found the $1.5 million bet you placed on my early grave to fund your son's future, using the money I bled to give you." She recoiled as if I had struck her with a physical blow, her face turning a ghastly, chalky white, her mouth opening in a silent scream of absolute exposure, realizing that the ultimate betrayal had been uncovered and that there was no scripture, no prayer, and no tear that could ever bridge the canyon she had just fallen into. "Enjoy the apartment, Evelyn," I whispered, stripping her of the title of Mama forever. And I turned my back on them, walking to my car, the click of my heels on the pavement echoing like the closing of a vault door. Leaving the house, the legacy, and the monsters who raised me behind in the rearview mirror as I drove back toward the city skyline, finally ready to begin living the 34th year of my life exclusively for myself. The drive back to my luxury condo downtown was a blur of neon city lights and the steady, rhythmic hum of the Mercedes engine, acting as a metronome for the rapid recalibration of my entire worldview. Because discovering that your family is financially bleeding you is a profound betrayal, but discovering they have literally monetized your potential death requires an entirely different level of psychological armor. I walked into my immaculate apartment, a sanctuary of glass, steel, and quiet that I had earned through sheer grit, and tossed the heavy faux leather binder onto the kitchen island, staring at it as if it were a venomous snake that had been sleeping in my bed for 7 years. I didn't pour myself a drink, and I didn't cry. Instead, I opened my laptop and drafted a meticulously detailed email to my attorney, David Ross, attaching high-resolution scans of the $1.5 million life insurance policy, instructing him to immediately contact the underwriters and launch an aggressive fraud investigation into how a 58-year-old woman secured a massive policy on her healthy, 34-year-old daughter without my explicit medical consent or signature. The next morning, David called me before I had even finished my first cup of espresso, his voice sharp with a mix of professional outrage and disbelief, confirming that not only had my signature been expertly forged on the original consent forms 7 years ago, but my mother had actually submitted falsified medical records obtained through a cousin who worked at a local clinic, artificially inflating my stress levels and fabricating a family history of heart disease to justify the exorbitant premium she was paying with my money. "We can have him arrested today, Cassandra," David had said, the protective instinct in his voice evident. But I simply looked out my floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Atlanta skyline and replied, "No, David, prison is too structured, too easy. I want the policy immediately canceled. I want every cent of the premiums they paid over the last 7 years refunded directly into my account as restitution for the forgery. And I want a formal letter of cancellation sent to Preston's last known address so he knows exactly how his lottery ticket went up in flames." With the insurance nightmare legally neutralized, I turned my absolute, undivided attention to the liquidation of the Oakcrest property, hiring the most ruthless, high-end estate sale company in the city to descend upon the house that Friday. Before I tell you about the shocking face-to-face confrontation I had with the members of my mother's church during the estate sale, I want to ask you, have you ever realized that the respectable people in your community are often just enablers who prefer a comfortable lie over an ugly truth? Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from, and if you've ever had to expose the fake image your toxic family projected to the world, because reading your stories reminds me why breaking these generational curses is so vital. Friday morning dawned bright and bitterly cold, and I arrived at the Oakcrest property just as the estate sale company opened the doors to the public, watching with a cool, detached satisfaction as strangers walked through the rooms of my childhood, placing price tags on the mahogany sideboard where the will had been, the floral sofa where Aunt Martha had sat, and the crystal glasses I had purchased for Evelyn's birthday. The village arrived shortly after, a flock of church ladies and neighborhood busybodies who had gossiped about my cruelty on Facebook, all pretending they were there to support the family while eagerly hunting for discounted antiques. But their performative morning came to a screeching halt when they saw me standing in the foyer, dressed in a flawless tailored suit, holding a clipboard and looking every bit the sovereign owner of the domain. Deaconess Hattie, a woman who had known me since I was in pews, marched up to me with a scowl that deepened the wrinkles on her face, clutching her purse as she hissed, "Cassandra Vance, you should be ashamed of yourself, parading around like a landlord while your 60-year-old father is forced into a tiny apartment and your 31-year-old brother is missing. You have brought a curse upon this family name." I looked down at her, refusing to break eye contact, and spoke loud enough for the entire entryway to hear, my voice echoing off the stripped hardwood floors. "There is no curse, Deaconess, only consequences. If you are so concerned about my brother, Perhaps you should ask why he forged my name on a $250,000 private equity loan to pay off his debts. Or better yet, ask Evelyn why she took out a fraudulent $1.5 million life insurance policy on my life, hoping the stress of paying her mortgage would kill me so Preston could be a millionaire. The collective gasp that rippled through the foyer was cinematic, the sheer horror of the truth instantly shattering the carefully constructed facade of the perfect Vance family. And I watched as Hattie's jaw dropped, her eyes darting nervously around the room as the other church members began whispering furiously, realizing that the rebellious daughter they had been judging was actually the surviving victim of a sociopathic financial plot. I didn't wait for her to formulate an apology. I simply turned my back on them and walked out the front door, leaving the community to devour the truth and the estate sale company to finish stripping the house bare, knowing that by Monday, the house would hit the market and the Vance legacy on Oakcrest Drive would be permanently erased. Over the next 3 weeks, my life became a testament to the sheer, unadulterated power of a woman who reclaims her energy, as I closed 2 massive commercial real estate deals, earning bonuses that far exceeded the money I had wasted on my family over the last 9 years, while the Oakcrest house sold in a bidding war for 30% over asking price, allowing me to fully recoup the fraudulent Apex loan and significantly pad my own investment portfolio. I hadn't heard a word from Evelyn or Silas, who were presumably trapped in the silent, suffocating reality of their rent-controlled apartment, forced to face each other without my money buffering their dysfunction. But the silence from Preston was an anomaly that made my instincts hum with low-level caution. That caution was validated on a rainy Tuesday evening when I received a frantic, tearful phone call from a number I hadn't seen in 3 years. It was Sheila, Preston's 29-year-old ex-wife, a hard-working nurse who had divorced him when she realized she was raising a man-child instead of a partner. "Cassandra, I am so sorry to bother you," she sobbed, her voice trembling over the line. "But Preston showed up at my townhouse an hour ago. He looks insane, completely unhinged, and he tried to force his way inside, screaming that you stole his inheritance and canceled his life insurance policy. I locked the doors and called the police, but before he ran off into the woods behind my complex, he yelled that if he couldn't have the payout, he was going to make sure nobody did." I stood up slowly from my desk, the blood turning to ice in my veins as I realized that by canceling the policy, I hadn't just taken away his financial safety net. I had backed a desperate, entitled narcissist into a corner, and a 31-year-old man who believes he has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous entity on Earth. I immediately hit the intercom to alert my building's security team, but before Maya could even answer, the heavy glass doors of my private office lobby shattered with a deafening crash, and I heard the chaotic, terrifying sound of heavy footsteps storming down the corridor toward my suite. The sound of shattering glass echoing through the executive suite wasn't just the destruction of property. It was the final, violent death rattle of the Vance family legacy. And as the heavy footsteps pounded down the corridor, I didn't dive under my mahogany desk or scream for help, but instead, I calmly reached beneath the lip of my desk and pressed the silent panic button that wired directly to the building's armed security detail and the local police precinct. Within seconds, 31-year-old Preston rounded the corner, his face twisted into a grotesque mask of feral desperation, his clothes soaked from the cold Atlanta rain, and his hands gripping a heavy metal tire iron that dripped with the blood of his own reckless entry through the lobby doors. He charged toward my private office, swinging the iron bar with a guttural roar against my door, expecting it to shatter just like the reception entrance. But he had forgotten that his 34-year-old sister was a senior architectural project manager who had personally designed this executive wing with laminated ballistic-grade security glass engineered to withstand a Category 4 hurricane. The iron bounced off the glass with a sickening thud, vibrating furiously up his arms and dropping him to his knees for a fraction of a second. And as he scrambled back to his feet, panting and leaving bloody handprints on the pristine glass, I simply remained seated in my leather chair, my hands folded neatly on my desk, watching him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a rabid animal in a reinforced enclosure. He began to scream through the thick barrier, his voice muffled but entirely decipherable, accusing me of ruining his life, of stealing his birthright, of canceling the $1.5 million policy that was supposed to save him, completely oblivious to the fact that his every word, his every swing, and his every threat was being recorded by the high-definition security cameras I had installed in the ceiling above him. Before I tell you about the crushing, final realization that hit my brother's eyes when the authorities finally arrived, I want to ask you, have you ever had to watch someone you once loved completely self-destruct simply because you refused to let them destroy you first? Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from, and if you've ever had to build literal and metaphorical bulletproof walls to protect your peace from your own blood. Because your stories are the foundation of this community, and a reminder that true strength often looks like walking away. I didn't flinch as he struck the glass a second time, a microscopic web of fractures spidering across the outer layer, but holding the inner sanctum perfectly secure. And I picked up my desk phone, dialing the precinct directly to inform the dispatcher that a violent intruder, currently under investigation for felony fraud, was actively attempting to breach my office. Preston saw me on the phone, and his rage instantly mutated into sheer, unadulterated panic. He threw the tire iron to the floor, pressing his face against the glass, screaming that I was his sister, that I owed him, that 58-year-old Evelyn and 60-year-old Silas were going to die in that tiny apartment because of my corporate greed. But his emotional manipulation was utterly useless against a woman who had already mourned the family she never truly had. Suddenly, the elevator dinged at the end of the hall, and 3 armed building security guards, closely followed by 2 tactical police officers with their weapons drawn, flooded the corridor, shouting sharp, deafening commands that finally broke through Preston's psychotic break. He spun around, raising his hands in a frantic, pathetic gesture of surrender, weeping openly as the officers slammed him against the wall, kicking his legs apart and ratcheting the steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists, reading him his Miranda rights as his entire fraudulent, subsidized life collapsed into a heap on my polished marble floor. I stood up smoothly, adjusting the cuffs of my silk blouse, and pressed the security release button under my desk, the magnetic lock disengaging with a soft click, and I stepped out of my office into the hallway, the scent of rain, blood, and ozone hanging heavy in the air as the officers secured the perimeter. Preston craned his neck to look at me, his face pressed uncomfortably against the cold wall, tears and snot mingling with the rain on his cheeks, begging me to tell them it was a misunderstanding, to pay his bail, crying that he wouldn't survive in a county jail because he was a Vance. But I simply looked down at the 31-year-old boy who had spent his entire life trying to bury me so he could comfortably stand on my grave. "You wanted to be the man of the house, Preston," I whispered, my voice carrying the quiet, devastating weight of absolute finality. "And now you are going to learn exactly what it costs to pay for your own roof, your own meals, and your own mistakes." I turned my back on him as the officers dragged him away, his screams echoing down the hallway until the heavy elevator doors closed, severing him from my life forever. And as I walked back into my office to instruct Maya to hire a cleanup crew for the lobby, my private cell phone began to vibrate violently on my desk. The caller ID flashed with my father's number, signaling that the local precinct had just notified Silas and Evelyn Vance that their golden son was being booked on charges of aggravated assault, destruction of property, and felony forgery, meaning my parents were finally receiving the midnight phone call they had spent 3 decades bleeding me dry to avoid. I didn't answer the phone, letting it ring until it went to voicemail, and then I systematically blocked the number, pouring myself a glass of sparkling water, staring out at the beautiful, sprawling city of Atlanta, realizing that the matriarch's grace isn't about carrying the world on your shoulders. It's about having the supreme, unbreakable elegance to simply set the burden down and lock the door behind it. The morning of Preston's arraignment arrived with a biting, unseasonal chill that stripped the last remaining leaves from the trees lining the courthouse plaza, a fitting atmosphere for the final, legal burial of the Vance family dynamic. I didn't have to be there. The prosecutor had already assured my attorney, David Ross, that the security footage of the attack and the overwhelming evidence of felony forgery were more than enough to secure a denial of bail given the violent nature of the breach. But I went anyway, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, not to gloat, but to bear witness to the exact moment the illusion of the golden sun was legally shattered. When I stepped into the gallery of the courtroom, the air felt heavy with the collective misery of the judicial system, and my eyes immediately found my 58-year-old mother, Evelyn, and my 60-year-old father, Silas, sitting in the second row, looking so diminished and frail they practically blended into the varnished wood of the pews. They had aged a decade in a single week. My father's shoulders were curled inward as if trying to protect his failing pride, and my mother, completely stripped of her Oakcrest matriarch status, wore a faded cardigan that hung loosely off her frame, her hands trembling as she clutched a crumpled tissue. They didn't see me slip into the back row, surrounded by my attorney and a private security contractor I had hired just to be safe. But they saw 31-year-old Preston when the bailiff led him out in a bright orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to his waist, his arrogant swagger completely erased by the harsh, fluorescent reality of the county jail. The judge read the charges in a booming, unforgiving voice: aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, destruction of commercial property, and multiple counts of felony fraud and forgery. And as the prosecutor detailed the staggering $250,000 theft and the chilling discovery of the fraudulent $1.5 million life insurance policy, a collective, audible gasp rippled through the courtroom, not from the strangers, but from my father. Silas turned slowly to look at his wife, his face a mask of absolute horror and profound betrayal, finally realizing that Evelyn hadn't just enabled a lazy son, but had actively plotted to cash in on their 34-year-old daughter's death, an entirely new level of depravity that even he had been kept in the dark about. Before I detail the devastating confrontation that happened in the courthouse hallway when my father finally found his voice, I want to ask you, have you ever witnessed the exact moment someone's carefully constructed web of lies unravels in public, leaving them with absolutely nowhere to hide? Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from, and if you have ever felt the profound, chilling peace of letting the brutal truth fight your battles for you, because your strength in the comments fuels this entire journey. When the judge struck the gavel and denied bail, citing Preston as a violent flight risk with no assets and a history of predatory fraud, my mother let out a wail that sounded like tearing metal, reaching desperately for the wooden partition as they dragged her sobbing son back to the holding cells. But Preston didn't look at her. He looked back into the gallery, his eyes locking onto mine with a mixture of terror and the crushing realization that his sister, the bank, the mule, and the victim was now entirely untouchable. I stood up to leave, my heels clicking a steady, even rhythm on the marble floor. But as I exited into the vast, echoey hallway of the courthouse, I heard my father's heavy, dragging footsteps rushing to catch up with me. I turned to face him, signaling for my security guard to give us a few feet of space, and I watched as Silas Vance, the man who had let me bleed for 9 years to protect his own ego, stopped a few feet away, his chest heaving, his eyes red-rimmed and broken. "I didn't know about the life insurance, Cassandra," he whispered, his voice cracking into a desperate plea for absolution from the daughter he had failed. "I swear to God, I knew about the loans. I knew he was taking the money, but I never would have signed off on betting against your life. Evelyn, she said it was just a standard policy for the mortgage." I looked at him, feeling a strange, hollow pity that completely lacked any warmth or desire to comfort, and I replied, "It doesn't matter what you knew, Dad, because your silence and your pride created the exact environment that allowed both your wife and your son to view me as a disposable asset. You let them use me, and now you have to live with the monsters you allowed to flourish." My mother stumbled out of the courtroom doors just in time to hear my words, her face ravaged by tears, her makeup smeared, completely lacking the pristine, judgmental elegance she had wielded like a weapon for decades. And she fell against the wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the cold marble floor. "We have nothing, Cassandra," she wept, her voice a hollow, defeated rasp. "The apartment is so quiet. The church won't even return my calls since the estate sale. And now my boy is in a cage. Please, you have won. You have taken everything. Just give us a little bit of grace." I looked down at the woman who gave birth to me, feeling the final, microscopic thread of my childhood attachment snap and dissolve into the sterile courthouse air, realizing that she still believed this was a competition, a game of wins and losses, completely incapable of understanding that I hadn't taken anything from them. I had simply stopped giving them myself. "Grace is what I gave you for 9 years, Evelyn," I said, my voice as calm and smooth as glass. "What you are experiencing now is not my vengeance. It is the mathematics of your own choices, finally balancing the equation." I turned and walked away toward the glass exit doors, stepping out into the crisp, biting air of the city, the sunlight reflecting off the skyscrapers like a brilliant promise of a future that belonged entirely to me, leaving them sitting in the shadows of the justice system to serve the life sentence of their own making. The weeks that followed the arraignment did not bring the sudden, miraculous emotional healing that cinematic narratives often promise, but rather a slow, methodical detoxification of my entire existence, a profound cellular shedding of the anxiety that had governed my life since I was 25 years old, allowing me to pour the relentless energy I had once used to keep my family afloat directly into my own empire, resulting in my early promotion to a junior partner at the firm by the time I was 34. I spent my days orchestrating high-stakes negotiations for skyline-altering developments, my mind razor-sharp and unburdened, while the tragic reality of my 58-year-old mother and 60-year-old father unfolded exactly as I had orchestrated, trapped in a tiny, rent-controlled apartment on the perimeter of the city, utterly invisible to the high society church circles that had once treated Evelyn Vance like royalty. The absolute silence from Oakcrest Drive was finally made permanent when the real estate closing documents were signed, sealing the sale of the 4-bedroom colonial to a young, affluent couple who had no idea they were buying a house built on 9 years of my stolen youth. And as the massive wire transfer hit my Chase private client account, fully reimbursing the fraudulent Apex Strategic Holdings loan and injecting a massive surplus of equity into my portfolio, I sat at my mahogany desk and watched the numbers on my screen, feeling not greed, but the cool, heavy satisfaction of justice mathematically rendered. But the village that had enabled my family's dysfunction for decades was not quite ready to let their favorite scapegoat slip away into untouchable success without one final, desperate attempt to drag me back into the mud, a fact that was proven on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Maya, my assistant, buzzed my intercom with a voice tight with perfectly masked alarm, informing me that my 62-year-old Aunt Martha and Reverend Jenkins were demanding to see me in the downstairs lobby, threatening to cause a scene that would embarrass the firm if I didn't come down. I didn't panic, I didn't call security to throw them out immediately, and I certainly didn't feel the old, conditioned terror of public shame. I simply saved my blueprints, smoothed the lapels of my impeccably tailored emerald green suit, and rode the glass elevator down to the grand, marble-floored lobby, watching as Martha and the Reverend stood aggressively near the reception desk, looking entirely out of place amidst the sleek, modern wealth of corporate Atlanta. When the elevator doors parted, Aunt Martha immediately lunged forward, her orthopedic shoes squeaking on the polished stone, her face twisted in a mask of righteous indignation as she pointed a trembling, arthritic finger at my chest, loudly declaring that my 31-year-old brother was languishing in a county jail cell, being beaten and starved, all because I refused to drop the felony forgery charges and show him the mercy of Christ. Reverend Jenkins stepped in, using his booming pulpit voice to echo through the cavernous lobby, placing a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder as he told me that a successful black woman owes a debt to her community, that I was tearing the fabric of our culture apart by putting my own flesh and blood in the prison system, and that God would strip me of my corporate blessings if I didn't immediately call the district attorney to arrange for Preston's release. I slowly reached up, gripping the Reverend's wrist with a terrifyingly firm, icy pressure, and physically removed his hand from my expensive blazer, my eyes locking onto his with a dead, hollow intensity that made him physically recoil, before I turned my gaze to Aunt Martha, speaking in a voice so dangerously quiet that the receptionist stopped typing just to hear the execution. "You did not come here to save my brother's soul, Aunt Martha. You came here because without my money funding Evelyn's lifestyle, your sister is constantly calling you for handouts, and you are terrified that you might actually have to open your own purse to support the family you claim to love so much," I whispered, watching the blood instantly drain from her face as the brutal, unvarnished truth hit her squarely in the chest. Before I tell you how I permanently banished the Reverend from my life, right there in the lobby, I want to ask you, have you ever had religion or cultural loyalty weaponized against you by people who just wanted to keep you subjugated for their own convenience? Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from, and tell me how you learned to separate true faith from the toxic manipulation of a self-serving community, because reading your stories gives me life. I turned my attention back to the Reverend, who was nervously adjusting his clerical collar, and I delivered the final blow, stating, "And you, Reverend, are only here because my father used to slip you a $500 tithe every single Sunday, a tithe that came directly from my bank account, so do not stand in my building and preach to me about the mercy of Christ when the only thing you are actually mourning is the loss of your most profitable donor." I didn't wait for their stammering rebuttals. I signaled to the head of building security, a towering ex-military man who had been silently hovering 10 feet away, and I loudly instructed him to permanently ban these two individuals from the premises, adding that if they ever stepped foot on the plaza again, they were to be arrested for criminal trespassing. I turned my back on them and walked back into the glass elevator, the doors sliding shut on the sight of Aunt Martha clutching her pearls and the Reverend staring at the floor in profound humiliation, severing my ties not just to my immediate family, but to the entire toxic ecosystem that had fed on my guilt for 34 years. When I returned to my office, the adrenaline slowly dissipating into a deep, crystalline calm, I noticed a piece of standard, state-issued mail sitting perfectly centered on my desk, placed there by the mailroom staff while I was downstairs. And as my eyes fell upon the return address, my breath caught in my throat. It was from the Fulton County Jail, penned in the frantic, jagged handwriting of my brother, Preston Vance. I didn't open it immediately, simply staring at the cheap, yellowed envelope that contained the desperate thoughts of a man facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary, realizing that this letter wasn't an apology, but rather a final, venomous strike from a narcissist who had realized his golden armor had completely melted away. And as I picked up my silver letter opener to slice through the seal, I knew that whatever was written on those pages would require me to make one final, devastating move to ensure the Vance legacy remained buried forever. I slid the silver letter opener beneath the flap of the cheap, yellowed envelope, the rasping sound of tearing paper echoing loudly in the quiet sanctuary of my office, and pulled out a single sheet of lined, institutional paper covered in Preston's erratic, deeply pressed handwriting. He wrote, "You think you won, Cassie. You think putting me in this cage makes you the queen of the Vance legacy, but you don't even know who built the trap you've been living in. Mom didn't forge your name on that Apex loan, and neither did I. Dad did." The words hit me like a physical blow to the sternum, forcing me to sit perfectly still as my eyes raced across the remaining lines, where my 31-year-old brother detailed exactly how our 60-year-old father, Silas, the man who had sat in the courtroom looking like a broken, innocent victim, had actually orchestrated the entire $250,000 fraud, using his old connections with a corrupt notary to stamp the documents, handing Preston the pen, and telling him that his 34-year-old sister owed her success to the family and wouldn't dare question it. Preston's letter wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was a scorched earth tactical strike, a spiteful promise that if he was going down for 20 years, he was going to drag the beloved, quiet patriarch of the family down into the concrete cell right beside him, completely shattering the illusion that my father was just a passive bystander to my mother's malignant narcissism. I didn't cry, and I didn't throw the letter across the room. I simply picked up my desk phone, bypassed my assistant Maya, and dialed my attorney David Ross, instructing him to immediately subpoena the notary records from the Apex Strategic Holdings file and cross-reference them with my father's former business associates from the late 90s. The confirmation took less than 48 hours, arriving in a secure digital dossier that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Silas Vance had not only secured the fraudulent notary, but he had actively negotiated the interest rate on the loan that was meant to ruin me, hiding behind Evelyn's loud, aggressive entitlement to mask his own quiet, calculated thievery. Before I tell you about the terrifyingly calm visit I paid to my parents' rent control department to confront the mastermind of my destruction, I want to ask you, have you ever realized that the quiet, supposedly passive parent in your toxic family dynamic was actually the covert architect of your suffering? Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from, and if you've ever had to face the devastating truth that the parent you were trying to protect was the one holding the knife. Because your stories give me the validation to keep exposing these generational secrets. I didn't call ahead to announce my arrival. I simply left my office early on a Friday afternoon, driving my Mercedes to the run-down Perimeter neighborhood where my 58-year-old mother and 60-year-old father were currently serving out the 6-month lease I had charitably paid for. I walked up the 3 flights of stairs, my tailored slacks and silk blouse a stark contrast to the peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights of the hallway, and I knocked on their door with 3 sharp, authoritative raps that demanded an immediate answer. Evelyn opened the door, her face instantly draining of color when she saw me standing there, her faded housecoat wrapped tightly around her thinning frame, and she instinctively stepped back, stammering my name as if I were a ghost returning from the grave. I didn't acknowledge her, simply walking past her into the cramped, dimly lit living room where Silas was sitting in a cheap fabric armchair, watching a muted television set, his posture instantly stiffening as he saw the icy, hollow determination radiating from my eyes. "Cassandra," he began, attempting to put on that same pathetic, broken man facade he had used in the courthouse hallway. "Why are you here? Has there been news about Preston?" I unclasped my briefcase, pulled out a pristine copy of Preston's jailhouse letter, along with the notarized evidence of his corrupt back-channel dealings, and dropped them onto the small, scratched coffee table directly in front of him. "Preston sent me a letter, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly even, low register that sucked all the oxygen out of the tiny room. And he was very eager to let me know that while Evelyn was busy taking out a $1.5 million bet on my death, you were the one who actually orchestrated the forgery on the Apex loan, utilizing your old friend Marcus from your real estate days to illegally notarize the document so your golden son could have his startup money. Evelyn gasped, bringing her hands to her mouth as she looked from the documents to her husband, clearly unaware of this specific detail, realizing that the man she had been protecting had thrown their son to the wolves to save his own skin. Silas stared at the papers, his jaw working silently, the fragile, elderly victim persona completely evaporating as his eyes hardened into a cold, calculating glare that finally matched the ruthlessness I had had to develop to survive him. "I built you, Cassandra," he suddenly snarled, his voice losing its tremor, revealing the bitter, entitled patriarch underneath. "You are a junior partner at 34 because I pushed you, because I gave you the Vance work ethic, and taking a little equity off your back to help your brother was my right as your father. You owed us that money, and sending your own brother to prison over a signature is a sin you will carry to hell." I didn't flinch at his venom, simply leaning forward until I was mere inches from his face, letting him feel the absolute freezing void where my daughterly love used to reside. I built myself, Silas, while carrying the dead weight of 3 adults strapped to my back. And you didn't take a little equity. You tried to steal my freedom, my credit, and my future, I whispered, watching his eyes widen as the sheer, unadulterated power of my boundaries finally suffocated his ego. I have already handed these documents over to the district attorney, which means by Monday morning, there will be a warrant issued for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit felony fraud, and you will be spending the rest of your golden years in a federal cell right next to the son you ruined. I turned my back on him, ignoring Evelyn's hysterical, screaming pleas for mercy as she fell to her knees, and I walked out of the apartment, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind me with the finality of a coffin lid, completely unaware that Silas's absolute, terrifying desperation was about to trigger a violent chain reaction that would put my physical safety in extreme jeopardy before the weekend was even over. The drive from the perimeter back into the heart of downtown Atlanta felt less like a commute and more like a tactical retreat, the rhythmic thud of my Mercedes windshield wipers fighting against a sudden, violent deluge of rain that mirrored the chaotic collapse of my family's facade. I parked in the secure underground garage of my luxury high-rise, my mind calculating the exact timeline of Monday's impending arrest, completely unaware that 60-year-old Silas Vance, a man facing the absolute annihilation of his pride and his freedom, was not going to wait for the authorities to arrive. I took the private elevator up to my penthouse, stripping off my wet blazer and kicking off my heels the moment I locked the heavy steel door behind me, craving nothing more than the profound, healing silence of my own sanctuary. I walked into the sprawling, dimly lit living room, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the storm-battered city skyline, and poured myself a neat glass of expensive bourbon, the amber liquid burning a pleasant, grounding path down my throat as I finally allowed my 34-year-old body to relax. But that hard-earned peace was violently shattered exactly 45 minutes later by a sound so subtle, so entirely out of place, that my brain almost refused to register it, the soft, electronic beep of the front door's secondary keypad, followed by the heavy, metallic click of the deadbolt disengaging. I froze, the crystal tumbler halfway to my lips, my mind instantly flashing back to the emergency keycard I had given my parents 5 years ago when I had a severe bout of pneumonia, a card I had completely forgotten to deactivate in the whirlwind of the Oakcrest eviction and the Apex Strategic Holdings fraud. I didn't scream, I didn't drop my glass, and I didn't run. I simply set the bourbon down on the marble kitchen island with absolute, terrifying precision, my eyes locking onto the shadowy figure stepping into the foyer, dripping wet and breathing with the heavy, jagged rhythm of a cornered predator. It was Silas, but he was completely stripped of the pathetic, broken elderly man persona he had worn in the apartment, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice, and my blood ran completely cold when he stepped into the ambient light of the living room, revealing the heavy steel barrel of the .38 special revolver he used to keep in the bottom drawer of his study at Oakcrest. He raised the gun, his hand shaking violently, the barrel pointed directly at my chest, and for a fleeting, surreal second, I looked at the man who had taught me how to ride a bicycle and realized he was entirely willing to murder his own daughter to avoid the embarrassment of a federal prison sentence. "You really thought you could just walk away, Cassandra?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a toxic cocktail of rage and sheer terror. "You think you can just hand me over to the district attorney and keep all this wealth for yourself while I rot in a cell?" Before I tell you how I reacted to staring down the barrel of my own father's gun, I want to ask you, have you ever realized that the people demanding your loyalty were actually willing to destroy your life the second you stop being useful to them? Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from, and if you've ever survived a moment where the mask completely slipped off a toxic parent, because reading your stories of survival is what anchors this community. I didn't raise my hands in surrender, and I didn't plead for my life. I simply stood my ground behind the marble island, keeping the heavy stone barrier between us, and spoke to him in a voice so dangerously calm and hollow, it seemed to unnerve him more than if I had screamed. If you pull that trigger, Silas, you don't just go to prison for fraud. You go to death row for first-degree murder, and all of this, the money, the legacy, the condo, will be liquidated and donated to charity, leaving Evelyn with absolutely nothing. He took a step forward, his wet shoes squeaking on the hardwood floor, pulling a folded, water-stained document from his jacket pocket with his free hand and tossing it onto the counter. I'm not here to kill you, Cassandra, unless you force my hand. You are going to sit at your laptop, you are going to log into your secure legal portal, and you are going to electronically sign this affidavit stating that you gave me verbal power of attorney to execute the Apex loan, and that the forgery charges were a vindictive misunderstanding. He was delusional, completely detached from the reality of the digital footprint and the concrete evidence already sitting on the prosecutor's desk, believing that a single piece of paper, signed at gunpoint, could magically erase the $250,000 theft and the paper trail of his corrupt notary. The district attorney already has the notarized files, the bank records, and Preston's written confession, Dad, I whispered, maintaining unbroken eye contact, watching the desperate gears grinding in his head as he realized his master plan was fundamentally flawed. Signing that paper won't stop the warrant on Monday. It will only add extortion and armed home invasion to your list of federal charges. I casually rested my hands on the edge of the kitchen island, subtly pressing my thumb against the biometric sensor of my smartwatch, activating the silent SOS emergency protocol I had set up after Preston's attack at my office, instantly broadcasting my live GPS coordinates and a distress signal to the local precinct and my private security team. Silas let out a ragged, frustrated sound that was half sob, half growl, stepping around the island and closing the distance between us, pressing the cold steel of the revolver directly against my forehead, the smell of damp wool and old aftershave making my stomach violently churn. You are going to sign it, or I swear to God, I will end this right now, because I am not dying in a cage while you live like a queen, he spat, his finger tightening on the trigger, the absolute madness of a fallen patriarch fully taking the reins. I didn't close my eyes, refusing to give him the satisfaction of my fear, and I simply said, "You were already dead the moment you chose Preston's potential over my reality. Shoot me, Silas, and prove exactly what the Vance legacy has always been." The heavy, suffocating silence of the condo was suddenly shattered by the explosive sound of my front door being violently breached by a tactical battering ram, the heavy steel frame splintering inward as half a dozen heavily armed SWAT officers poured into the foyer, their laser sights sweeping the dark room and locking instantly onto my father's chest. "Drop the weapon! Drop the weapon now!" the lead officer roared, the deafening command freezing Silas in his tracks, the reality of his completely inescapable doom finally short-circuiting his nervous system, and the revolver slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the marble floor as he dropped to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. The officers swarmed him, violently pinning the 60-year-old man to the ground and wrenching his arms behind his back to apply the heavy steel cuffs, reading him his rights as I calmly took a step back, picking up my glass of bourbon and taking a slow, steady sip, watching the architect of my suffering being reduced to a sniveling, broken criminal on my living room floor. But as they hauled him to his feet to drag him out of my sanctuary, Silas stopped struggling, his head snapping up to look at me, a twisted, vicious smile breaking through his tears, a smile that promised one final, devastating psychological blow. "You think you know everything, Cassandra. You think you figured out the whole puzzle," he laughed, a wet, manic sound that echoed over the police radios. "You think Evelyn wanted that $1.5 million life insurance policy just to make Preston rich? Ask her about the family in Charlotte, Cassandra. Ask your mother why she desperately needed $1 million to keep a secret that is going to tear your perfect, sovereign world to absolute pieces." He was dragged out into the hallway, his manic laughter fading into the elevator shaft, leaving me standing alone in the ruins of my Friday night, the cold bourbon suddenly tasting like ash in my mouth, as I realized the Vance family rot didn't end with financial fraud. It ended with a hidden bloodline I knew absolutely nothing about. The heavy steel door to my penthouse had been temporarily secured with a reinforced titanium brace by the building's emergency maintenance crew, but the physical damage to the entryway was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological crater my 60-year-old father's final words had blasted into the center of my mind, leaving me sitting perfectly still on my velvet sofa as the Atlanta sunrise painted the storm-washed city in shades of blood orange and bruised purple. Silas was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, entirely stripped of his belts, his shoelaces, and his patriarch status, facing a minimum of 20 years for armed home invasion, extortion, and felony fraud. But his parting gift, the cryptic, venomous mention of a secret family in Charlotte, had fundamentally shifted the tectonic plates of everything I thought I knew about my 58-year-old mother, Evelyn. I didn't rush to my car to kick down the door of her rent-controlled apartment and demand answers like a hysterical, emotionally volatile child. Instead, I poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee, opened my encrypted laptop, and dialed the direct, unlisted number of Sterling Hayes, an elite corporate private investigator I retained for performing deep-dive background checks on cutthroat real estate developers. Sterling, I need a comprehensive, scorched earth financial and genealogical audit on my mother, Evelyn Vance, focusing specifically on any wire transfers, property deeds, or sealed court records connecting her to Charlotte, North Carolina over the last 40 years. I instructed, my voice as sterile and precise as a surgeon calling for a scalpel, authorizing a $10,000 emergency retainer to ensure I had the results before the weekend was over. For the next 48 hours, I existed in a state of absolute, unshakable sovereignty, turning my phone on silent, ignoring the frantic, chaotic voicemails from Aunt Martha, who had just discovered that her brother-in-law was locked up for attempted murder. And I spent my weekend finalizing the architectural layouts for a new commercial plaza, refusing to let the toxic implosion of my bloodline disrupt my 34-year-old peace. On Sunday evening, the encrypted file arrived in my secure inbox from Sterling, containing 50 pages of meticulously sourced documents that completely rewrote the history of the Vance family, revealing a secret so dark, so steeped in generational hypocrisy, that it actually made me laugh, a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the high ceilings of my empty condo. Evelyn Vance, the self-righteous, scripture-quoting matriarch who had judged every woman in her congregation for decades, had given birth to a daughter in Charlotte when she was 19 years old, a child named Valerie, whom she had completely abandoned at an orphanage in order to move to Atlanta, wipe her slate clean, and marry the respectable Silas Vance. But the true horror wasn't the abandonment. It was the financial records from the last 9 years, showing that exactly a decade ago, this abandoned daughter had tracked Evelyn down and began ruthlessly extorting her, threatening to expose the perfect Christian mother to her church, her community, and her husband, unless she was paid a staggering monthly silence fee. Before I tell you how I confronted the woman who had literally bled me dry to pay for the sins of her past, I want to ask you, have you ever discovered that the perfect family image you were forced to sacrifice your life to maintain was actually built on a foundation of unforgivable lies? Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from, and if you've ever had to completely shatter the fake, pious illusion of a toxic parent, because reading your stories of uncovering the truth is the oxygen that keeps this engine running. I stared at the bank statements in Sterling's dossier, realizing with absolute, sickening clarity that the $5,200 I had been sending my parents every month for 9 years wasn't just paying for the Oakcrest mortgage. It was being meticulously divided, with thousands of dollars secretly wired to Charlotte to keep Valerie quiet, meaning I had sacrificed my entire 20s to fund my mother's blackmail payments, and the fraudulent $1.5 million life insurance policy they took out on me wasn't just to make Preston rich. It was because Valerie had demanded a massive $1 million lump sum to disappear forever, and Evelyn had literally bet on my death to buy her own reputation back. I printed the entire dossier, slipping the warm pages into a pristine manila folder, and drove my Mercedes through the quiet Sunday evening streets to the perimeter apartment complex, carrying the ultimate weapon of mass destruction in my manicured hands. I didn't knock. I used the master key the property manager had given me, unlocking the door and stepping into a dark, suffocatingly quiet apartment that smelled of stale air and absolute defeat, finding my mother sitting alone at the small dining table, staring blankly at the wall, completely shattered by the fact that her husband and her golden son were both sitting in Fulton County jail cells. She slowly turned her head to look at me, her eyes hollow, lacking any of the fiery, entitled rage she usually possessed. And she whispered my name like a prayer, hoping that I had come to save her from the isolation of her own making. But I simply walked to the table and dropped the heavy folder directly in front of her. "I know about Charlotte, Evelyn," I said, my voice completely devoid of any daughterly affection, stripping away the title of Mama forever, as I watched the last remaining drop of blood drain from her face, her entire body beginning to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor, as her eyes fell upon the birth certificate of Valerie Hayes that lay on top of the stack. "I know that for 9 years, I didn't just pay your mortgage. I funded your extortion. I paid for the silence of the daughter you threw away like trash. And I know that you tried to monetize my death to buy your permanent salvation from a secret that would have ruined your precious church standing." She didn't try to deny it, she didn't scream, and she didn't quote scripture. She simply collapsed forward onto the table, her hands clutching her head as she let out a guttural, animalistic wail of absolute, complete exposure, realizing that her 34-year-old scapegoat had just permanently dismantled the matrix of her entire existence. "Please, Cassandra, you don't understand what it was like back then. I was a child. I couldn't keep her. And when she found me, she was so angry. She was going to destroy everything Silas and I had built," Evelyn sobbed, her tears soaking the documents that proved her monstrosity. "I had to protect the family. I had to protect Preston." I leaned down, bringing my face level with hers, my eyes cold and unblinking, the absolute embodiment of quiet, untouchable sovereignty. "You didn't protect the family, Evelyn. You sacrificed one daughter to pay off another, and you fed your only son to his own greed," I whispered, the brutal truth hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. "And the ultimate irony is that by tomorrow morning, I am mailing this entire dossier to Reverend Jenkins and every single deacon in your congregation, meaning you sold my soul to protect a reputation that I am going to burn to ashes anyway." I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my silk blouse, and walked toward the door, leaving her screaming my name in the dark, completely alone with the ghosts of the children she had destroyed, while I stepped out into the cool southern night, finally, truly, and permanently free. Monday morning arrived with the crisp, undeniable clarity of a newly signed contract, and true to my word, I didn't hesitate for a single fraction of a second. Before I even stepped into the glass-walled boardroom of my firm to lead the weekly architectural strategy meeting, I had a private courier deliver 50 meticulously bound copies of Sterling's explosive dossier directly to the administrative office of Evelyn's congregation, ensuring a copy landed on the desk of Reverend Jenkins, the head deacons, and every prominent member of the church's social committee. The social execution was swift, brutal, and entirely engineered by the very people my 58-year-old mother had spent her entire life trying to impress. Because in the cutthroat, judgmental ecosystem of Southern church politics, discovering that the pious, scripture-quoting matriarch of the Vance family was actually hiding a 39-year-old abandoned daughter and funding a massive extortion scheme with stolen money was the equivalent of blood in shark-infested waters. By noon, my phone was silently rejecting dozens of frantic calls from my 62-year-old Aunt Martha, who had undoubtedly received her copy and realized that the perfect sister she had always defended was actually a fraud of biblical proportions, completely obliterating any moral high ground Martha thought she held over my 34-year-old successful, independent existence. I didn't revel in the chaos, and I didn't monitor social media to watch Evelyn's reputation burn to ash. I simply sat at my desk, reviewing the structural load capacities for a new commercial skyscraper, finding a profound, unshakable peace in the fact that I had finally excised the tumor of my family's generational hypocrisy. But the true test of my newly fortified boundaries didn't come from the shattered remnants of the Atlanta village. It arrived on a quiet Wednesday afternoon when my assistant Maya buzzed my intercom with a tone of confused hesitation, informing me that there was a woman on line 3 calling from a Charlotte, North Carolina area code, claiming to be my older sister. I paused, my architectural pen hovering over the blueprints, realizing that since I had permanently severed Evelyn's financial supply, the monthly extortion payments to Charlotte had abruptly stopped, meaning the 39-year-old ghost of my mother's past had finally run out of easy money and was now desperately seeking the deep pockets of the corporate executive sister she had likely been stalking online for years. I pressed the flashing button on my console, the cool leather of my executive chair squeaking softly as I leaned back, and I answered with a perfectly modulated, entirely detached greeting, refusing to offer any warmth to a woman who had essentially been holding a knife to my mother's throat for a decade, while I bled to pay the ransom. "Cassandra," the voice on the other end said, carrying a harsh, jagged edge of unearned familiarity and thinly veiled entitlement. "This is Valerie. I know Evelyn probably never mentioned me, but we share a mother, and since the old lady suddenly stopped sending my monthly support checks, I figured I'd reach out to the sister who has all the money to let you know that my silence isn't free." Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled the delusions of a blackmailer who thought she could intimidate a woman who had just locked her own father in a federal cell, I want to ask you, have you ever had a toxic, estranged relative crawl out of the woodwork the moment they smelled money, expecting you to fund their life simply because you share a bloodline? Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from, and if you've ever had to ruthlessly shut down an entitled family member who thought your success was a communal asset, because reading your stories of enforcing financial boundaries is what gives this engine its power. I listened to the sharp intake of her breath over the receiver, visualizing this woman I had never met, realizing she had likely constructed an entire narrative where she was the tragic victim owed a massive financial debt by the universe, completely unaware that she was attempting to extort the single most dangerous, emotionally sovereign woman in the state of Georgia. "Evelyn never mentioned you, Valerie, but my private investigator certainly did," I replied, my voice dropping to that terrifyingly calm, absolute zero register that had made cutthroat developers sweat in my boardroom. "I know exactly who you are. I know that you are 39 years old, and I know that for the last decade you have been committing federal extortion against our mother, a crime that was inadvertently funded by my bank account." There was a momentary, stunned silence on the line, the aggressive confidence in Valerie's tone fracturing as she realized I wasn't going to play the shocked, easily manipulated sister role she had anticipated. But she quickly rallied, her voice raising in volume as she spat. "She owed me that money, Cassandra. She threw me away like garbage to play house with your precious daddy and your golden brother. She owes me for 39 years of pain. And since she's broke, you're going to pay me, or I'm going to the press to expose the great Cassandra Vance's trashy family secrets." I let out a low, dark chuckle that completely lacked humor, the sound echoing through my expansive, glass-walled office, sending a chilling message across the state lines that she had wildly miscalculated her leverage. "You are 39 years old, Valerie, which means you are entirely too old to believe that a sob story justifies a felony," I stated, my words precise and lethal. "And as for exposing my family's secrets to the press, you are about 3 days too late, because I have already mailed a 50-page dossier detailing your extortion, Preston's $250,000 fraud, and Silas's federal arrest directly to the community. I burned the Vance family reputation to the ground myself, meaning you have absolutely nothing left to threaten me with." She gasped, the reality of her completely powerless situation crashing down upon her, realizing that the golden goose she thought she had cornered had actually slaughtered the entire flock. But she tried one last desperate tactic, whining that we were sisters, that blood had to mean something, that I couldn't just leave her with nothing when I had millions. "We are not sisters, Valerie. We are simply two women who had the immense misfortune of being born to a narcissistic coward," I whispered, delivering the final, fatal blow to her financial fantasies. "And if you ever call my firm, my private number, or attempt to approach me again, I will hand Sterling's extortion file over to the FBI, and you can spend the next decade sharing a cell block with the father who tried to shoot me last Friday. The bank is closed, Valerie, and the Vance family ATM has been permanently demolished." I hung up the phone, severing the call and immediately instructing Maya to block the Charlotte area code from our switchboard, feeling the absolute triumphant rush of a woman who had finally sealed every single leak in her emotional and financial fortress, realizing that the matriarch's grace doesn't just mean surviving the storm. It means becoming the lightning that strikes down anyone who tries to build their castle on your back. The click of the phone receiver settling into its cradle after disconnecting the call from Charlotte was the sound of the final lock snapping shut on the impenetrable vault of my new life, leaving me sitting in the quiet, climate-controlled perfection of my executive office, realizing that for the first time in 34 years, I was completely untethered from the parasitic expectations of my bloodline. The following month passed in a blur of unprecedented professional triumphs, as the energy I had formerly used to micromanage my parents' crises, fund my brother's delusions, and silently absorb the toxic fallout of their hypocrisy was now entirely channeled into my own ambition, resulting in my firm awarding me the lead architectural role on a billion-dollar downtown revitalization project that secured my financial independence for the rest of my natural life. I celebrated this victory not by throwing a lavish party or seeking the validation of a community that had so quickly turned on me, but by quietly doing the one thing I had denied myself for 9 years. I purchased a pristine 2-acre plot of waterfront property in an exclusive gated enclave outside the city, writing a cashier's check for the full amount and signing the deed with a gold monogrammed pen, securing the land where I would design and build my own custom sanctuary, a home entirely free of Vance family ghosts. But while my empire was rising, the rotting foundation of the family I had left behind was finally collapsing under the weight of its own deceit, a reality confirmed by a phone call from my attorney, David Ross, who informed me that the criminal proceedings against my 60-year-old father, Silas, and my 31-year-old brother, Preston, had devolved into a vicious, bloodthirsty spectacle of mutual destruction. "They are eating each other alive in there, Cassandra," David had reported, his voice tinged with the professional disgust of a man who had seen the worst of human nature, explaining that Preston, terrified of federal prison, had immediately flipped on Silas, offering to testify that our father was the sole mastermind behind the $250,000 Apex Strategic Holdings fraud and the armed home invasion, while Silas countered by offering the prosecutor evidence of Preston's illegal gambling rings and secondary extortion attempts, completely obliterating any remaining shred of their Vance men solidarity as they desperately clawed at each other's throats to secure a plea deal. Before I tell you about the pathetic final ambush my mother attempted when she realized the men she had worshipped were tearing each other apart, I want to ask you, have you ever watched the toxic people in your life finally turn their venom on each other the moment you stepped out of the line of fire? Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from and if you've ever experienced the profound, quiet validation of watching your abusers destroy themselves without you having to lift a single finger. Because reading your stories of vindication is what empowers this narrative. The fallout of their mutual betrayal left my 58-year-old mother, Evelyn, completely exposed and entirely isolated. A reality that arrived uninvited on my doorstep on a rainy Thursday evening when the concierge of my luxury high-rise buzzed my penthouse to inform me that a disheveled woman, claiming to be my mother, was weeping in the lobby, begging to be let up. I didn't instruct security to throw her out into the storm. I simply told them I would come down, stepping into the glass elevator wearing a flawless silk slip dress and a cashmere wrap, my posture perfectly aligned, and as the doors parted to the grand lobby, I saw the former matriarch of Oakcrest Drive looking like a shattered, hollowed-out shell of the woman who had once demanded my obedience. Evelyn was shivering, her clothes damp, clutching a cheap plastic shopping bag containing what looked like the last of her belongings. And as she saw me approach, she didn't possess the arrogant rage of a woman wronged. She looked at me with the desperate, pathetic submission of a drowning victim who had just realized she had actively sunk her own lifeboat. "Cassandra, please," she sobbed, her voice echoing off the marble pillars, drawing the subtle, uncomfortable stares of the building's affluent residents. Martha changed the locks on me. She told the whole congregation about Valerie. They took away my deaconess title, and the landlord at the apartment you rented said I have to leave because Silas's legal bills drained the account. I have nowhere to go, honey. I am your mother. You have to let me stay with you. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from her, the physical distance feeling like a million miles of impenetrable emotional armor. And I looked into the eyes of the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely no urge to fix her, no desire to comfort her, and no obligation to sacrifice my hard-earned peace to soften the landing of her catastrophic moral failure. You are not my mother, Evelyn. You are simply the woman who used my 34-year-old existence as a human shield to protect your own ego, I said, my voice completely smooth, devoid of anger but vibrating with absolute, terrifying sovereignty. You abandoned one daughter in Charlotte to save your reputation, and you tried to sacrifice your second daughter in Atlanta to save your son, placing a $1.5 million bounty on my head while I worked myself to the bone to keep a roof over yours. She reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the edge of my cashmere wrap, weeping that she was sorry, that she had been blind, that Silas had manipulated her, playing the ultimate victim card in a desperate bid to extract one final drop of my subsidized empathy. I didn't swat her hand away. I simply took a deliberate step backward, allowing her hand to fall into empty space, forcing her to grasp nothing but the air of her own isolation. Silas didn't manipulate you, Evelyn. He just matched your darkness, I replied, the truth ringing through the quiet lobby with devastating clarity. And as for you having nowhere to go, I suggest you reach out to the son you chose over me, or perhaps the daughter you threw away, because this building, this life, and this wealth belongs exclusively to the woman you tried to destroy. I turned my back on her as she collapsed onto the plush lobby sofa, her wails echoing behind me like the ghosts of a past I had successfully exorcised. And as the glass doors of the private elevator closed, taking me back up to the penthouse, where the city lights glittered like a million diamonds of unbothered peace, my phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Sterling Hayes, my private investigator, containing a single, chilling photograph that proved Evelyn was still hiding one final, unforgivable secret that would require me to burn the absolute last bridge to the ground. The glass elevator ascended with a silent, frictionless speed that completely juxtaposed the violent, concussive pounding of my heart as I stared down at the glowing screen of my smartphone, my eyes locked onto the encrypted photograph Sterling Hayes had just transmitted to my private inbox. It was a scanned copy of a heavily redacted 10-year-old legal document bearing the unmistakable seal of the Fulton County Probate Court and the elegant, looping signature of my late maternal grandmother, Lucille, a woman who had always looked at me with a fierce, knowing pride before she passed away when I was 24. I stepped out into the quiet, climate-controlled perfection of my penthouse, dropping my cashmere wrap onto the velvet sofa without taking my eyes off the screen, zooming in on the specifics of the document. And as the legal jargon suddenly translated itself into plain, horrifying English in my mind, the very last pillar of my 58-year-old mother's carefully constructed universe, completely atomized into dust. The document was the establishment of an irrevocable generational trust, fully funded by the sale of my grandmother's vast agricultural land holdings in South Carolina, totaling nearly $2.8 million. But the true devastation wasn't the amount of money. It was the beneficiary designation, which explicitly named 24-year-old Cassandra Elaine Vance as the sole and exclusive heir to the entire fortune, completely bypassing Evelyn and Silas. I walked over to the marble kitchen island, my hands shaking with a fine electric rage that transcended simple anger and bordered on absolute cold-blooded awe at the sheer scale of their sociopathy, realizing exactly what had happened 9 years ago when I turned 25 and my parents had suddenly come to me, weeping about imminent foreclosure and begging me to take over the $5,200 monthly Oakcrest mortgage. They hadn't been broke. They had been actively stealing from me, utilizing a forged power of attorney document, the second page of Sterling's attachment, bearing another amateur forgery of my signature, executed by my father and notarized by his corrupt associates, to illegally intercept my grandmother's trust fund, draining the $2.8 million to pay off Valerie's initial extortion demands in Charlotte, fund 31-year-old Preston's early, disastrous business ventures, and maintain their lavish lifestyle. And when they had successfully bled my inheritance completely dry, they had the unmitigated, sociopathic audacity to cry poverty and force me to use my own hard-earned corporate salary to pay the mortgage on the house they were living in. I didn't pour a drink, and I didn't cry for the lost millions, because the money was secondary to the profound psychological violation of realizing that my entire adult life, my relentless work ethic, and my exhausting dedication to the strong black woman provider trope had been meticulously engineered by a mother who had robbed me blind before I even had a chance to build my own empire. Before I tell you how I cornered the corrupt family attorney who had facilitated this massive generational theft, I want to ask you, have you ever discovered that the people who claimed they were heavily relying on your success had actually stolen your foundation before you even started building? Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from, and if you have ever had to aggressively reclaim what was legally and spiritually yours from the hands of the people who raised you, because your stories of ultimate vindication are the lifeblood of this community. I immediately dialed David Ross, my attorney, ignoring the fact that it was past 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. And when he answered, I didn't bother with a greeting. I simply forwarded the encrypted file to his secure server and stated, "David, Evelyn and Silas didn't just forge a loan 6 months ago. They forged a power of attorney 9 years ago to embezzle a nearly $3 million trust fund left exclusively to me by my grandmother. And I want the attorney of record who filed this fraudulent paperwork disbarred, bankrupted, and indicted by Monday morning." David's sharp intake of breath over the line confirmed that he understood the catastrophic legal magnitude of this discovery, realizing that Evelyn Vance wasn't just a desperate mother making bad choices for her son, but a calculating, predatory mastermind who had orchestrated a decade-long financial siege against her own flesh and blood. The next morning, I did not go to my architectural firm. Instead, I dressed in a razor-sharp, tailored burgundy power suit, slipped my grandmother's vintage gold watch onto my wrist, and drove directly to the opulent, mahogany-paneled offices of Arthur Pendleton, the 68-year-old estate lawyer who had been a fixture at Vance family Sunday dinners for my entire childhood, the man who had, supposedly, guided my parents through the probate process after my grandmother's death. I bypassed his terrified secretary, pushing open the heavy oak doors to his private suite without knocking, and found the elderly attorney sitting behind his massive desk, his face instantly draining of all color as he saw the absolute, terrifying sovereignty radiating from my 34-year-old presence. "Cassandra," Arthur stammered, attempting to rise from his leather chair but failing as his knees betrayed him. What a surprise. I heard about the terrible situation with Silas and Preston. I have been meaning to call you to offer my deepest condolences for the family's troubles. I didn't sit down, choosing to stand directly over him, casting a long, imposing shadow across his polished desk as I dropped the thick, bound dossier containing the forged trust documents, the falsified power of attorney, and the wire transfer logs straight onto his pristine blotter. "You don't need to offer me condolences, Arthur. You need to offer me a confession," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly, quiet register that made the expensive artwork on his walls seem to vibrate with tension. "Because I know exactly how you helped Evelyn and Silas bypass probate, seal my grandmother's directives, and illegally siphon $2.8 million of my inheritance into offshore holding accounts 9 years ago, leaving me with nothing but the burden of paying their mortgage while they lived off my stolen wealth." Arthur's hands began to visibly tremble as he stared at the documents, the realization dawning on him that the quiet, obedient daughter he had helped defraud had evolved into an apex predator who had completely outmaneuvered him. And he weakly attempted to defend himself, whispering that Silas had threatened him, that Evelyn had convinced him I was too young to handle that kind of wealth, that they promised the money was being safely managed for the family's future. "You didn't manage the money, Arthur. You laundered it," I countered, leaning forward so he could see the absolute lack of mercy in my eyes. "And as of this morning, my legal team has submitted this entire file to the State Bar Association, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the federal prosecutor currently handling my father's extortion case. You have exactly 24 hours to turn over every single piece of communication, every bank routing number, and every hidden asset attached to my parents, or I will ensure that you spend the last years of your life sharing a cell block with the men you helped empower." I didn't wait for his pathetic, stammering agreement. I turned my back on his ruined career and walked out of the office, stepping into the bright, blinding sunlight of downtown Atlanta, realizing that the ultimate punishment for my mother wasn't just homelessness or social exile. It was the impending, inescapable knock of federal agents at whatever cheap motel door she was hiding behind, coming to arrest her for the theft of my past, completely securing the untouchable, brilliant sovereignty of my future. The capitulation of Arthur Pendleton was not a slow, dignified surrender, but rather a rapid, pathetic collapse of a man who realized his entire legacy of country club respectability and mahogany-paneled privilege was about to abruptly end in a federal indictment and, true to my ultimatum, within 24 hours, his terrified legal team had electronically transferred over 1,000 pages of encrypted banking ledgers, wire transfer receipts, and hidden offshore account routing numbers directly to David Ross. I spent Saturday morning sitting at the expansive marble kitchen island of my penthouse, a cup of black coffee cooling beside me as I scrolled through the digital evidence of my own financial assassination, watching the clinical, mathematical proof of my 58-year-old mother's sheer sociopathy unfold on the screen. The ledgers explicitly detailed how Evelyn, not my 60-year-old father, was the primary architect of the embezzlement, aggressively directing Arthur to funnel my grandmother's $2.8 million trust into untraceable shell companies before aggressively distributing the funds to pay Valerie's extortion demands in Charlotte, cover Preston's staggering gambling debts, and finance the lavish, performative church donations that secured her untouchable matriarch status. The sheer audacity of her betrayal was breathtaking, entirely recontextualizing the 9 years I had spent sacrificing my 20s to pay her $5,200 Oakcrest mortgage, realizing she had essentially been standing on my throat while demanding I apologize for bruising her shoes. I didn't shed a single tear for the mother I had lost, because you cannot mourn an illusion, and I immediately authorized David to hand the entire Pendleton dossier over to the federal prosecutor, triggering a massive, inescapable chain reaction that finally brought the full, terrifying weight of the United States government crashing down upon the Vance family legacy. Before I tell you about the final, chilling conversation I had with my mother behind the reinforced glass of a federal holding facility, I want to ask you, have you ever realized that the person who played the loudest victim in your life was actually the most ruthless predator in the room? Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from, and if you've ever had the profound, unsettling validation of watching the law finally expose the covert narcissist who manipulated your entire family, because your stories of ultimate vindication are the bedrock of this journey. The inevitable arrest happened on a bleak, rain-swept Tuesday morning when a specialized financial crimes task force raided a cheap, cash-only motel on the absolute outskirts of the city, kicking down the flimsy veneer door of room 114 to find Evelyn Vance hiding in the dark, clutching her worn leather Bible as if the scriptures could magically shield her from federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy charges. I was standing on the pristine, untouched soil of my newly purchased 2-acre waterfront property, reviewing the architectural blueprints for my custom estate with my lead contractor, when David called my private line to inform me that Evelyn was currently sitting in a sterile interrogation room, hysterically refusing to speak to a public defender and frantically demanding that her 34-year-old junior partner daughter come down to the precinct to clear up this horrible misunderstanding. I didn't owe her a response, and I certainly didn't owe her my presence, but I instructed my contractor to proceed with the groundbreaking, climbed into the warm, leather interior of my Mercedes, and drove downtown to the Federal Building. Not to save her, but to personally deliver the final, irrevocable eulogy to her entitlement. When I was escorted into the holding area, the heavy steel door clicking shut behind me, I found Evelyn sitting on a bolted metal chair behind a thick pane of smudged, reinforced glass, dressed in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that completely swallowed her diminishing frame. Her hair unkempt, her face completely stripped of the flawless makeup and arrogant pride she had weaponized for decades. She picked up the heavy black receiver on her side of the glass, her hands violently trembling, her eyes wide with a desperate, feral hope as she saw my perfectly tailored camel coat and pristine posture, genuinely believing that the strong black woman conditioning she had violently drilled into my psyche would force me to post her bail and sweep her felonies under the corporate rug. "Cassandra, oh thank God, thank Jesus you came," she wept into the phone, her voice a ragged, breathless plea that echoed through the earpiece. "They treated me like a common criminal. They dragged me out of that motel in handcuffs. You have to call your lawyers, honey. You have to tell them Silas and Arthur handled all those papers. You have to tell them I didn't know what I was signing." I picked up the receiver on my side, my hand perfectly steady, my face an impenetrable mask of absolute, icy sovereignty, and I looked directly into her terrified, calculating eyes, refusing to let her hide behind the illusion of ignorance for one more second. "Arthur gave us the ledgers, Evelyn," I whispered, my voice completely flat, devoid of any anger or daughterly sorrow, watching the desperate hope instantly shatter and bleed out of her expression. "I saw the emails you wrote directing the wire transfers. I know you used my grandmother's $2.8 million trust to pay off Valerie's extortion in Charlotte. I know you bought Preston's loyalty, and I know you spent my inheritance to buy your seat at the head of the church table, leaving me completely bankrupt so you could manipulate me into paying for the roof over your head." She stopped crying, her tears instantly drying up as the realization hit her that the manipulative, sweet mother facade was entirely useless against the hard, mathematical evidence of her own greed, and her face suddenly twisted into a bitter, ugly mask of venomous resentment. "She left it all to you," Evelyn hissed, her voice dropping the victimized tremble, revealing the jealous, malignant narcissist she had always been. My own mother bypassed me, her only child, to leave millions to a 24-year-old girl who didn't know the first thing about sacrifice. I was the one who built the Vance name. I was the one who suffered with your father. I deserved that money, Cassandra, and I only took what was rightfully mine. I didn't flinch at her confession, and I didn't raise my voice to argue with a woman who had fundamentally justified the absolute destruction of her own child. I simply stood up, the soft rustle of my expensive coat serving as the only sound in the sterile room, and I looked down at her with a profound, terrifying pity. "You didn't build a name, Evelyn. You built a cage," I replied, my tone cutting through the thick glass with the precision of a laser. "And you didn't take what was yours. You stole the foundation of my life. But the greatest tragedy of your existence is that despite stealing millions, despite sacrificing me, abandoning Valerie, and ruining Preston, you are still ending up exactly where you belong, completely and utterly alone in a concrete box with absolutely nothing left to sell." I gently placed the black receiver back onto the hook, cutting off her frantic, screaming rebuttal, her mouth moving soundlessly behind the bulletproof glass as she frantically banged her fists against the partition. But I simply turned my back on the ghost of the woman who birthed me, walking out of the holding area and stepping through the heavy federal doors into the bright, brilliant sunshine of the Atlanta afternoon. The air smelled of rain and concrete, but as I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the atmosphere of my total, unconditional liberation, I realized that the heavy, suffocating mantle of the unbreakable foundation had finally been completely dissolved. I had paid the ultimate price, navigating the profound darkness of my family's betrayal, but I had emerged on the other side not as a mule to be ridden, but as a queen to be reckoned with. I unlocked my car, sliding into the driver's seat, and as I started the engine, my phone buzzed with an alert from my bank, confirming that the initial asset seizures from the Pendleton accounts had already begun depositing the recovered millions back into my private portfolio, funding the magnificent, sprawling waterfront estate I was about to build entirely for myself, officially concluding the era of my sacrifice and ushering in the flawless, untouchable reign of my quiet sovereignty.